Thanks for having me here. I know several people on this panel, including Lindsay, Sean, just met Josh. I will say this, it's kind of cool, and I'm going to be the one to say it for Sean. He just won $50,000 on the $100,000 pyramid that I watched the recording. This was this week. I watched the recording this morning and actually was fist pumping all over my apartment as you did this, so it was kind of cool. I cover soccer, as Jackie mentioned. One reason I cover the sport is because it's the global sport and it has the widest variety of stories, I think, of any sport that touch on all aspects of society and politics and culture, and basically every country in the world plays this sport. And there's also gender discussion to be had with soccer. And because this is a panel about the Olympics, I'm going to talk about stuff connected to Olympic soccer, and because the U.S. men never seem to qualify for the Olympics, and did not this year, I'm going to talk about U.S. women's soccer. And unfortunately for the U.S. women, who won the World Cup last year and have been generally regarded as the best women's soccer team in the world for decades, they went out in the quarterfinals of the Olympics this year. It's the earliest they've ever gone out in a major tournament. And yet there's still lots of really interesting discussion to be.
Maybe switch.
All right.
Sure.
Does this work? It's got a red.
Is it red?
No, it's green.
No, it's green is good.
So this is good. Ooh.
Sorry.
Thank you. There are a lot of interesting topics connected to this U.S. women's soccer team right now. Three in particular that I'm going to bring up here in the next few minutes. One of which is an ongoing dispute between the U.S. women's soccer players and the U.S. Soccer Federation over equal pay for equal play, as the players would put it. And this has gotten a lot of attention ever since earlier this year the U.S. women's players filed a complaint with the EEOC about wage discrimination compared to the U.S. men's soccer players, who make quite a bit more money, or at least have over the years, and whose prize money for the World Cup, the U.S. men got $9 million for going out in the round of 16 in their last World Cup, which was quite a bit more than the U.S. women got for winning the Women's World Cup last year. I think it was around $2 million. Even though the television broadcast, I also do stuff for Fox Sports, we had that game, had 27 million people watch it in the United States, which was the most ever for any soccer game in the United States, male or female, over the years. And so there's a collective bargaining agreement that the U.S. women's players have with the U.S. Soccer Federation that pays the players a certain amount depending on how well they do in World Cups, and pays them per game for every time they play with the national team. The U.S. men's players have a similar collective bargaining agreement with U.S. Soccer that pays them different amounts. So there's so much happening in the wider context right now because equal pay for genders is a huge part, or a big part of this election cycle that we're seeing. And we've seen Hillary Clinton put out Twitter posts supporting the U.S. women's soccer players in this ongoing dispute. And so it's something to keep following here. And I, as someone who follows this very closely and speak to both sides, my sense at this point is the talks between the U.S. players, women's players, and U.S. soccer start again in October, and it could get pretty contentious. The players could go on strike as soon as January 1st. Their collective bargaining agreement, the current one, runs out. And I don't think we'll have an answer from the EEOC about their wage discrimination complaint by then, but I do think from a PR perspective, this was pretty brilliant on their lawyer to go public with this and have that potentially help, I think, their CBA talks. So this is something that's going on in the background here, and in talking with the U.S. women's players, they feel like this is something that they need to take a stand on. Do I think they will get more pay in the next collective bargaining deal? I think they will, significantly more. Do I think they'll get equal pay to the U.S. men? I'm not so sure about that, and I think even the players on the women's side maybe aren't so sure about that. They're just trying to get the best deal possible, but this is going to be an ongoing thing that we see. Because among all the women's sports athletes in America, I would argue that this team of the U.S. women's soccer players is probably as well known, as powerful as any of them, or more so. And I think it's going to set a standard for how women's soccer players in other countries fight for their own recognition and investment by their own federations, which is pretty shamefully low in several other countries, but also other women's sports in the United States, too. Now, the most influential player on this U.S. women's soccer team behind the scenes and pushing for fighting, taking on U.S. soccer is the goalkeeper, Hope Solo, who is, I think just about everyone who follows the sport would agree, the best goalkeeper in the world over the last decade, probably. She's been playing the World Cup since 2007. She's a game changer in a lot of ways, even though she's 35 now, I think. But during this Olympics, she got more controversial attention again, and I've covered her for a long time. After the U.S. went out unexpectedly in the quarterfinals against Sweden, I asked her what she thought about the game in the post-game session, and she's always had pointed thoughts, but she was actually really upset with the way Sweden played, a very sort of conservative style, not really trying to, they packed things in, realized the U.S. was a better team, and just tried to score on the counterattack on a quick strike. And Solo went off on that and said this was cowardly. That was the word that got people all riled up. I think she said cowardly twice. And was generally viewed as a poor sport. This, because it's the Olympics, because she's representing her country, because there's a lot of media attention on every little thing that happens in the Olympics, as Ryan Lochte can tell you, became a huge deal. And I don't think she quite realized how big a deal it would become. And a couple weeks ago, after everyone was back home, U.S. Soccer announced that it was terminating Solo's contract with U.S. Soccer, that they were punishing her not just for what she said in this post-game statement calling the Swedes cowards, but what U.S. Soccer called a long list of transgressions, kind of a lifetime achievement award, as they would put it, from over the years. Now, some of those past incidents include last year she was suspended for a month after her husband got a DUI driving a U.S. team van that she happened to be in. This happened in L.A. She was also involved in a fourth-degree misdemeanor, as she would want everyone to hear, but domestic violence case in Seattle in a family dispute involving her half-sister and nephew. Now, the facts have always been in dispute on that. That's why U.S. Soccer did not suspend her for that. But U.S. Soccer never suspended her for that, and a lot of people publicly thought they should. Now, this was right before the World Cup last year. So what's inescapable, I think, is U.S. Soccer, the federation, has not given Solo any punishment or a harsh punishment for things that happened right before the World Cup when they needed her most last year, when she was a game changer. And now they've given her a 6-month suspension and terminated her contract, a much more severe penalty for ostensibly calling the Swedes cowards, which she would say is, probably not the word I should use, but you're, that's what I said. This is kind of like a post-game speech. So there's that's going on. She's filing a grievance. She thinks that U.S. Soccer is punishing her because of her influence in organizing the players to try and get equal pay. So there's a lot going on there too, that we'll have to wait and see what happens. My take happens to be, though, that there are no big women's soccer events for 3 years now until the next World Cup in 2019. That's why U.S. Soccer could get away with suspending it for 6 months. But if she actually wanted to play again for U.S. Soccer, it's not that big a deal, in my opinion. Like, she would miss like 4 games, maybe 6, that aren't that important. They're just exhibitions, friendlies. And she gets 3 months severance on her terminated contract. And every U.S. women's player's contract ends on December 31st anyway, when their collective bargaining agreement ends. And yet, her response was clearly one of anger, that they terminated her contract, fired her. And so she has said, I'm not playing for my club team in Seattle for the rest of the year. She doesn't think she's going to go back to the national team. And so I think her response probably could have been more measured. I think U.S. Soccer, I don't totally know why they terminated her contract in addition to suspending her for 6 months, unless they wanted to just set her off. Now, while all of this is happening, another story that you may have followed, that people outside soccer followed last year, a big one, was all these arrests at FIFA. And the US FBI and Department of State, having undertaken a very big, costly investigation, raided the hotel where a lot of the FIFA bigwigs were staying before the FIFA Congress back in late May of last year. And finally, this organization, FIFA, which oversees global soccer, which has been thought of as corrupt and shady for so many years, is finally fearful of a governing, of a body, an entity, and that's the United States. And what's happened is they've arrested a lot of top international soccer officials from different nationalities. The US FBI has justified that it's within their jurisdiction because a lot of this money has gone through US banks. And it's totally overturned everything at FIFA. And Sepp Blatter, the longtime president, was forced out finally. Now, what all this means for women's soccer and women in soccer, stick with me here, is that the new FIFA and the new officials that are replacing the old ones are talking a really good game right now about making women's soccer bigger around the world, especially in countries where it's always been treated poorly or it doesn't even exist. There's just no support, no investment. And we're also seeing now, finally, women getting into positions of power at FIFA, which oversees the sport globally. And to give you an idea of how bad it is, FIFA has been around for over 100 years, and they did not get their first woman on their board until 2013. This is a completely male-dominated, male-only culture for so long. When I've dealt with these guys, it's like a Mad Men episode come to life, basically, in the 21st century. And finally, they're starting to, they have new statutes this year where each continent is now required to have at least one woman on the continental board that then represents that continent on the FIFA board. And it's not enough, but it's getting closer, finally. And then FIFA is starting a women's soccer department that they're going to name an executive director for very soon here. So they're talking a very good game. They have a new president, a guy named Gianni Infantino, Italian-Swiss guy, who says women's development, women's soccer, women in soccer, is going to be the biggest thing happening in FIFA over the next so many years. But it's still talk, so that's something to keep an eye on moving forward here. And for me, This is, Jackie talked about how important sports is, but the idea of getting women involved in the global sport in countries where in a lot of it's not happening or hasn't happened, to me is a really important story to follow in the years that come ahead.